In this video, I want to talk about active recall and moving it forwards a little bit, because Ali spoke about it back in 2018, which repeated a lot of what Roediger actually said in 2013, but Ali added in Dunlosky's overview research paper on all of the different study methods, not just retrieval practice, not active recall, small differences, but I want to add to this conversation and add a little bit of a different perspective. A quick disclaimer, I am not a medical student, nor am I in university at the moment, and I didn't go to Cambridge or Oxford or any high prestigious university, so I am different from a lot of the individuals that are speaking about active recall, spaced repetition, and study techniques on YouTube. Yes, there are other people talking about it, but the majority, here are the stats, are medical students, which is fine. I've watched the top 100 videos about active recall, and almost all of them reference Ali's video, and they don't do any of their own research into any of the papers. But some of them do reference some of the papers, all of them having actually been referenced in Ali's video, so I'm going to use Ali's as the sort of baseline of where YouTube is currently at in the conversation. To repeat what Roediger said back in 2013, learning is memory. It's learning how to bring information into memory, which is the process of encoding information, and then improving that learning can be done through retrieval practice. In the research, practice testing or retrieval practice are used sort of interchangeably, active recall appearing in a couple of studies, but they still basically mean the same thing, and what they are essentially doing is showing that the testing effect appears when you pre-test or you post-test or you test before you do the exam, the assessment. You're actually more likely to get better results, and the Dunlosky study actually showed a very nice table summarizing loads of different study methods that you can see in the table on screen. They later show a summary table of all of these techniques. Now, when you look at this table, you can probably disregard most of these techniques when done alone, but more recent research actually suggests that when you combine some of these techniques with retrieval practice, not active recall, traditionally flashcards as it seems to be seen on YouTube, but retrieval practice, lots of different types of retrieval practice, when you combine these things together, you can actually get better results. For those unfamiliar with retrieval practice, practice testing, active recall, Roediger and Kapicki, I think is how you say his name, did a study back in 2006 where they did, okay, you're going to study 4 different times, you're going to study, test, and then you're going to study, test. And basically the people that did the testing got better results. And this trend is the testing effect, which we saw way back in the early 1900s, and we are still seeing now. So we know the testing effect is a thing, we know it's useful, but how can we actually use it? In 2011, Karpicki and Blunt did a test with concept mapping, retrieval practice, study, and repeated study, and yes, retrieval practice still came out on top, but more recent research actually suggests when you combine concept mapping, which is an elaboration tool, elaboration interrogation is the cognitive psychological term for it, when you do this concept mapping combined with retrieval practice, you're actually more likely to get better understanding. So for regurgitation of information, retrieval practice, great, but when you want to understand where all those points fit in the different dynamics, different environments, different moving and changing environments, which I'll actually add to the conversation later on, when you add those different elements in, so the world that we're actually living in, concept mapping is very useful for getting a better and deeper understanding of the knowledge that you're trying to gain and things that you're trying to learn. Now, for essays and exams, concept mapping often isn't needed because most essays in education are just, okay, can you answer this question? Yes, great, you're smart. Not necessarily because you can't retrieve it and you can't apply it to practice, but they are two different things. Being able to retrieve information, theory, and being able to use information, practice, are two different things. As Ali mentioned in his video, lots of cognitive psychology does what's called prediction testing or judgment of learning testing, where you ask the participants what do you think will be the best result, and as mentioned, the more popular results were essentially the ones that were easier to be done. The techniques that require the least amount of mental energy, mental effort are preferred over the ones that you have to try, which kind of makes sense where humans are just lazy. And we can actually take this concept into whatever we're going to use to revise and learn and do retrieval practice. The harder the questions are, the harder the conversation is, the harder the concept map is, the harder whatever it is that you're trying to do is, the more effort you have to put into memory, the more likely you are to remember it. And this thinking can be moved into things that are easier to remember, but this is where I'm going to transition to active recall and flashcards a little bit. Flashcards are great, but more recent research has suggested that if you get rid of flashcards because you've remembered it, because it's somewhat easy, you're actually less likely to remember it because you've dropped it. You've dropped the flashcards. You actually need to keep the flashcards. So even though it's easy to remember, it means it's also easy to forget unless you've gone through a process of trying to encode, remember that information over a long period of time. Yes, some some things are easy to remember straight away, and that is potentially because you can attach it to existing schema, existing emotions, existing states in your mind that already exist, and essentially you have a shortcut to get to that memory. But just because it's easy to remember doesn't mean it's actually encoded in your mind. It just means that it was easy to remember in that situation, at that repetition, at that point in time, which again is going to change over time as you move towards the exam, towards the assessment, towards actually applying the theory in practice. And I'm sure most of you can relate to this, but things you've learned in first year, second year, third year university, maybe you've graduated, maybe you're still in education, but the things you learned at school, primary school, a lot of the stuff you just forget. When you go back and you do like year 6, year 7 tests, you can't remember any of that stuff because you haven't applied any of it. And the same principle applies in learning for essays. If you're learning for an essay, learning for an assignment, and you know the thing at that point in time, that's great, but are you going to be able to apply it later on? If not, then that's where you need to do retrieval practice. And retrieval practice, if you're doing flashcards for everything that you're doing, you won't be doing anything else in life, so we need to find a different way or an alternative way of retrieving information. Now, my undergraduate degree was in sports coaching, so that's social science, that's coaching pedagogy, cognitive psychology, all of the different elements of sports science, so that's anatomy and physiology, biomechanics, all of those different elements of learning, whether that's motor learning or cognitive learning. Now, motor learning is going to be different from cognitive learning and being able to regurgitate information for an essay or for an assignment, because motor learning, there's a dynamic environment. There is the weather to consider, there are the opponents to consider, all of the different movement points in your body. So degrees of freedom is something that we need to consider when we're learning a skill, learning a physical skill, whether you're using perception action to try and see something, maybe your eyesight is blurred for an infection in your eye, or maybe it's blurred because of something that's happened in the environment. You've just been, I don't know, the grass or the wind has got in your eyes. There's loads of different things that can affect the ability to perform a skill. So learning a skill, learning a physical skill through motor learning, you can't just do practice tests and that be it. You can't do flashcards for how to do something. You need to experience lots of different ways of doing the skill, doing the movement, with different constraints and affordances in the environment. Now, that's moving into skill acquisition rather than revising for an essay or an assessment, but that is where I think retrieval practice is more applicable globally when it comes to learning than active recall. Retrieval practice and active recall maps better with the information processing approach to learning motor skills and skill acquisition, but looking at the ecological dynamics approach, taking it out of the sports context for a second and putting it into the essays and things that you're learning. Okay, you've been given this question on an exam, great. Are you under the same stress in the working environment? Do you have the same constraints in the working environment? In the medical field, I don't know, this is me guessing, but I'm assuming different people are going to have different responses to medication, so the answer to a question may need a little bit more context, which is where flashcards need more context. And this again comes back to how are you doing the retrieval practice? What quality of retrieval practice are you actually putting in? Are they just repeated, regurgitated flashcards, or are they contextual questions that are being challenged? And this is where I think we can combine study techniques together, potentially moving forwards in all of our different ways of learning. So elaborative interrogation and self-explanation both alone are not as good as retrieval practice, but when you're doing elaborative interrogation such as mind mapping or concept mapping, and you're needing to retrieve information, it can be more useful because you're retrieving information, so you have that practice testing, that testing effect playing a role, but you also have the benefits of concept mapping and getting a global understanding of where this information comes in and where it can apply to other pieces of information. So that's combining two techniques together. Self-explanation done verbally can bring in a different experience in that learning environment, which can bring in emotional cues, different states, and can bring in other questions when you are trying to articulate something, because trying to articulate the answer or articulate something or how something works brings in a different part of your brain, different part of your mind. So the encoding experience is slightly different and potentially can have more triggers, more cues for memory, which we know cueing helps memory. Now, is that going to make it easier to recall? Yes. So you could argue that it's become easier to recall, therefore you're not going to remember it, but you could then also argue that, well, now it is a schema, now it's a bigger schema. There's a cluster of information that we have brought together into this bigger experience, which makes it easy to remember because we have the experiences. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know and I'll explain it in the comment section below. Summarization, highlighting, the keyword mnemonic, imagery for text learning, and rereading. Now, all of those have low utility alone, but when we look at retrieval practice, what helps retrieval practice? Note-taking. I know Ali mentioned in his video that note-taking wasn't useful, but it depends what note-taking you're actually doing. Recent studies have actually suggested that when you add cues into when you're doing a study session, when you add cues in, i.e. take a note to help you remember something, you're more likely to remember it first time round, then second testing round you don't need the cue. So the note-taking is beneficial, and you can use highlighting as that type of cueing. Keyword mnemonics, again, can make something easier first time round for the second time of testing. So combining these low utility study techniques to help the retrieval practice in the first session can be taken away in the second practice, or may even be needed in the second practice, but using those study techniques alone, not very useful. Combining them with retrieval practice can then bring in the advantages that those study techniques have, which one of them being motivation. In the 2013 talk, mediated effects were spoken about, so motivation, time that you can actually do the studying, and feedback were three big mediated effects of retrieval practice. And if you're using study techniques that can increase motivation or decrease the time that you're doing something, or potentially give you different ways of having feedback, can help the retrieval practice. And moving forwards with feedback, if you're having a conversation with someone, potentially the same level of understanding as you, and you're going backwards and forwards with this conversation, you're having to retrieve information to have a discussion, potentially an argument with that person, retrieve the information, say it, then you have to justify what it is, again bringing in dynamics. You're bringing in something that's unknown into the retrieval, which is the other person, because they may say something that you can't remember, you've forgotten, or they may ask a question that you don't know. So you're bringing in unknown elements into this retrieval, plus it's much more fun to talk to people, from my experience anyway. And then the feedback given can also give you different motivations, internal motivations, to best your friend or be smarter than that person, or to find something that they don't know, or ask them a question that they're not sure about. But if you ask them a question that they don't know the answer to, you need to make sure you know the answer to that as well. So it brings in a bit of fun and games into revision, which can be done in classrooms and has been done in classrooms, which you can look at Tom Sheringham's work, and he's spoken about retrieval practice in the classroom in lots of different ways, and that's not using flashcards. But this practice testing active recall is still being used as a concept, it's just being applied in a different way, using all of these study techniques that alone have low utility, but combined together, high utility. Expanding on the motivation and feedback of this conversation, going backwards forwards a little bit, teaching is useful because there are different emotional states, and teaching what it is that you've learned or what it is that you're trying to understand can help learning, because it is a process of retrieving information, because you need to remember whatever it is that you're going to say, and you need to be able to articulate it. So there's more mental processing going on, because you need to remember it, then form it into something that is coherent to whoever it is that you're explaining it to, and you need to consider what they understand. And this is how teaching can be beneficial in learning, but that's a whole nother video. I don't like the Feynman technique, and this is why. But explaining things to other people also brings in something that I personally experience quite a lot at university, is when you have a discussion or a conversation, or potentially even an argument with a lecturer, it comes up again, whether you like it or not. Someone will talk about that conversation, or they'll try and find something that you didn't know or you got wrong, and then it becomes a conversation going on throughout the year. From my experience in sports coaching, we had conversations about certain topics first year, and they lasted all the way through to third year, but the conversation evolved because as we learnt more things about this environment, this concept, this topic, whatever it was, the conversation just got added to. So we were constantly doing spaced repetition, distributed practice, interleaved practice, whatever you want. We were constantly revising what it was that we were doing, because we were having similar conversations throughout our degree. Now, I've done a master's degree in strength and conditioning, and the whole way through my 5 years of higher education, I've hardly used any flashcards. I think I used a couple of flashcards in Notion just to see if I could, which I could, and I've done a video on that. Spaced repetition in Notion, great, but I don't use them. And then for the imagery with text example, yes, they said there needs to be more research in understanding what's going on, but when it comes to imagery, like actual imagery in here, it's really, really useful for motor learning and skill acquisition, which again, physical learning, learning a skill, learning a movement, imagery, being able to visualize yourself in your mind is really useful and is being used in performance psychology. So imagery here is drawing, is images actually on paper. And again, these combined with retrieval practice can be useful. So the process of drawing the image may not be that useful when taken away from retrieval practice. But if you're using an image, just an image with no words or anything like that, with your flashcard, well, now it becomes useful. So it certainly depends on the application of the images and the drawings that's being used, because the process of making that image could take a little bit of time, could take a little bit of effort, but that becomes an experience. And again, that experience can be attached to the practice testing that you're doing, which again builds up this schema, builds up this encoded information that you're trying to remember when it is that you are trying to apply the information that you're learning. This is an ongoing conversation and everyone's going to have different experiences with using flashcards, not using flashcards, different elements of retrieval practice and learning and memory, so I urge you to contribute in the comment section below. I have left the sources in the description below, and for those that have waited all the way to the end, my Wikipedia article has 120 references, so feel free to dive through that. Again, I will leave the link in the description below, so I look forward to hearing what your thoughts are.